So we're sitting here in the main collection of the Kunstsammlung 20 in Düsseldorf, and there's no doubt that this is one of the most stunning collection of early 20th century art, mostly by artists from Europe, work that was created in Europe that has its very legitimate place in the canon of art history. However, it's very interesting to allow ourselves to imagine how could we approach these artworks in a new way if we were to allow them to enter into dialogue with works that are coming from other places, by artists that probably we don't know as well, from cities that have been considered, quote-unquote peripheral or on the margin. So as we were talking earlier today about how Cairo was a center in its own right, so much as Paris was a center or New York was a center, how could this kind of network, how could we think of these cities as parts of a network, of a movement that is fluctuating all the time, enhance our understanding of what we have come to consider as canonical or established, art historical references, specifically in connection to Surrealism. So this is a painting by Ramses Yunan, who in 1938 wrote a book called The Purpose of the Contemporary Artist. And in this book he said Surrealism is going through some sort of crisis. It's faltering in its steps. We need to find a new definition that makes sense to what Surrealism should be like today in 1938. So he said there are two kinds of Surrealism. There's the Surrealism of Dali and Magritte. Many works of these artists are here in the collection, and their works are too preordained, pre-ordered, pre-thought. There's too much planning that goes into them, so they lose that spontaneous kind of impulse that is supposed to be very much, at the heart of this kind of subconscious drive that is in Surrealism. We're standing here in front of a Dali from 1936, Le Cabinet Anthropomorphique, and it's actually very interesting that we have this work in the same museum where we're showing Art et Liberté, because as we were saying before, there was a strong criticism of the kind of surrealism that Dali and Magritte were kind of putting forward, which according to Ramses Yunan, who coined the term subjective realism as a new definition for surrealism, was a surrealism that was too calculated, too planned. I mean, you look at this painting with all the details and all the thinking that went into it, it's not actually coming out from a spontaneous impulse of the subconscious. It's actually something that was very, very carefully thought through. And according to Art et Liberté, this kind of surrealism does not work. It needs to be more spontaneous and more free. So it's interesting to kind of be able to look at this great work, there's no doubt about that, through the lens of what we have been discussing and what we see with Art et Liberté, and allow ourselves to imagine a new kind of surrealism with a new definition, a new aesthetic that does not necessarily have to look like a Dali or a Magritte, but looks like what surrealism was like at the time in Cairo.
I think what's very exciting about the exhibition Art et Liberté is that it actually fills a great gap in art history at large, but I think also in the presentation of the Kunstsammlung. Germany is a country that had a very, very big rupture from the early 1930s until the 1940s. There really was not much artistic production at all. Artists weren't expressing themselves freely, and even after the war, people had very different concerns. Rather than engaging in art and going to art museums, it was a question of rebuilding a country, rebuilding a society, and actually of survival in many cases. So I think what's exciting about this group of artists is that their main period of activity was exactly in this period. We're speaking about the late 30s until the late 40s. But it is also one of those cities that aren't really looked at very often in art history. The presentation in the Kunstsammlung is very much based on masterpieces. So we have great, very important, fantastic artworks by some of the most known artists worldwide. Many very famous paintings are here in the collection. But it is also presented in a very typical way by going from earlier pieces to later pieces. And it suggests that art history is linear. One period follows the next one, and then you react to it or you learn from it. And what our point of view is that actually, when you look a little bit beyond these places, that art history actually is much more an insular happening in many different places where people communicate with one another, but it is really not linear, and it is not necessarily in a continuous way. So the exhibition really, I think, fills that gap maybe, but also disrupts and asks again do we only look at masterpieces, or what is really the story behind it? What is it that connects everything, and how can we go beyond a general story and try to understand it from a new perspective?
So Art et Liberté, Rupture, War and Surrealism is a traveling exhibition, which makes it even more exciting because given the city where the exhibition is shown, allows us to kind of reconfigure the show, connect to the collection of that particular institution, but also to the narrative that is surrounding that particular place and the artists that come from that place. So the debut of the show was at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, where of course Surrealism all began according to the canon that we have inherited by Breton and his friends in 1924. And it's very interesting to see how Art et Liberté was in dialogue with Breton or the Bretonian circle, but at certain times in agreement, at other times in disagreement, leading to that rupture with the movement in Paris in 1948. So kind of making that relationship or highlighting that relationship and bringing it more to the fore to show the similarities and discrepancies. When the show then went to the Reina Sofia, it was a nice homecoming of sorts because the manifesto of the group, which was published in 1938, was illustrated by an image of Guernica. And it was the first time, almost 70 years later, that Guernica, the painting, and the image of Guernica on the manifesto are brought together under the same roof. So that was a very, very nice dialogue there.
And what's interesting about the presentation in Germany is really the notion of degenerate art that was very prominent in the manifesto and was actually entitled as such. The manifesto takes a very clear position in favor of those artists that were being defamed. So it has definitely that strong international connection to what was happening in Europe. So the exhibition is slightly adapted to actually reflect the context here in the Kunstsammlung in Düsseldorf. The Art and Liberty group took a very active stance, aligning themselves with these group of artists that were called degenerate artists by the Nazis in Germany, by the Nazi party. And we're standing here in front of a painting by Paul Klee. The manifesto of Art and Liberty specifically lists Paul Klee as one of those artists with whom they felt they were in solidarity with. The other thing that's very interesting about Paul Klee is that he actually went to Egypt in the late 20s, and many of the motifs are also again inspired by motifs that you would find in Egypt, ancient Egypt, pharaonic Egypt in particular. I think what is important to note is that the exhibition is traveling, but that was from the beginning also one of the curatorial concepts of the show at large. It was very important to reflect the internationalism of the group. You know, the artists came from a lot of those places, have direct links with those places. So for us, it really always made perfect sense to really, from the beginning, make it an international tour and explore those connections, because that is really the spirit of the group and what these artists were actually very much interested in. So the core of the show definitely is traveling to all 5 venues, and then it's actually every time adjusted just a little bit to kind of highlight the local context.